This is just our clinic, the people that are part of our team. We have a new member that you can't see on here, who next time that you join us, you will see him on here. We consider ourselves a center for excellence in brain health, and this is just a slide kind of talking about what distinguishes us from others. We think about it as the tools we use, the training we do, the time we commit. And so we spend a lot of time really focused on being able to provide state-of-the-art, high-quality, cutting-edge treatment for the people that we work with. This slide is just, I'm certainly not going to read through this, but just it's a list of the people who have influenced us along the way, trainers, mentors, people whose legacy we follow. And as you can see, it's a long list, and they come from a variety of backgrounds. We feel very grateful to them for everything that they have taught us and will continue to teach us. As a brain health clinic, we are kind of unique in that we do both assessment and treatment. Many places you go, you either get treatment or you get assessment and then treatment. We do both of them. Treatment includes in-clinic options as well as at-home and in-school options. And we like to say in the brain health clinic that we don't treat symptoms, but we train dysregulation. We really look at strengthening brain functions so that skills can be developed. And this is really the focus of what we do. So somebody might come in and say, I've got anxiety, can you help me with that? Our response to that is, yes, we can. What we'll do is find out where the dysregulation in your brain is, and that's what we'll do is train that. What we know is that inevitably that's going to have some impact on their emotional and behavioral and cognitive experiences as well. So what our focus tonight is to talk about the difference between neurostimulation and neurofeedback. We're going to look at what the differences are. We're going to talk about the strengths of each approach, and then talk about how we choose when we apply each one of these. And then we'll give you some case studies for neurofeedback and neurostimulation that will help you to get a good sense of what we do with these particular protocols. So neurofeedback and neurostimulation, we think of them as paradigms. So they're two different paradigms that tend to complement each other. When a person's brain network is disrupted, the behavior in the individual oftentimes becomes disrupted as well. And so we do an assessment of the brain through QEEG, evoked response potential. We also include genetic testing, neurocognitive testing, sometimes psychological assessment as well. And through that assessment, we do an analysis that allows us to form some hypotheses about what might be happening and how dysregulation may be impacting the brain. And then we use that information to help us determine what type of training we're going to do. The way that neurofeedback and neurostimulation can complement one another is that with neurostimulation, in general, what we're doing is demonstrating to the brain what we'd like it to achieve. So we're basically just showing it what to do. Neurofeedback is a paradigm in which we're teaching the brain what to do. So we're kind of through a gradual process of teaching it how to behave in a certain way. It learns how to do that kind of for the long run. And so oftentimes what we'll do is a combination of neurostimulation and neurofeedback. So neurostimulation maybe to begin to help the brain understand what we want it to do, and then maybe moving over into neurofeedback so that the brain can actually have time to really learn how to create that new neural circuitry. What we're looking at is two paradigms that have one goal. The goal is to regulate brain function. So the first paradigm, we use this analogy a lot to talk about the paradigms. If you think about the idea of enjoying music, right? There are different ways that we can enjoy music. One way, is to listen to it. So for example, we might sit and listen to somebody play piano and really enjoy that music, right? If we listen to that same piece being played over and over and over for a long enough time, our brain might learn it on its own. But for the most part, this is a pretty passive way of enjoying music, right? We're just kind of letting the music have an impact on us. This is what neurostimulation is like. It's a passive treatment paradigm. I'm going to spend some time talking with you about the different types of neurostimulation that we do in the clinic. We're going to talk about transcranial alternating current stimulation. We're going to talk about transcranial direct current stimulation. We're going to talk about transcranial random noise stimulation and pulsed electromagnetic field stimulation. What kind of all of these have in common is they promote brainwave functioning. It can help reduce inflammation in the brain and different parts of the body, and can increase oxygen flow to the brain as well. So sometimes when we do a QEEG and we analyze it, we find that there are certain areas in the brain where the neurons are not communicating well, like they're out of synchrony. And that out of synchrony is a dysregulated brain process going on. So we might use transcranial alternating current stimulation to address this kind of dysregulation. The goal of it is to pass current. So we have two electrodes. We have one that's got a positive current, so that's the anode. And then we have one that has a negative current that is called the cathode. And so what tACS is doing is just running current back and forth between those two sites. So we might put an electrode on two different sites on the scalp, and then we run the treatment, and it's literally getting neurons between those two areas to start firing. And as it does that, it has a tendency to generalize as well. And so what starts to happen is those neurons between those two sites start to kind of come into phase with one another, start to be a bit more synchronous. And that can bring the dysregulation into more of a balance. An example of this, I had a client who had a pretty severe OCD. She was a 22-year-old young lady. She came in as soon as she graduated college, pretty severe OCD that was making it difficult for her to do anything but live at home. She couldn't work at the time. She had kind of been successful in her last couple of years of college because she did them online, and so she didn't have to go anywhere for it. She came in, and what we found is that we had a lack of synchrony in her brain waves. And so we actually did a combination with her of some neurostimulation and then some neurofeedback. And the neurostimulation was what we used to kind of teach her brain initially how to kind of have those neuronal connections fire in the right way. And so we had she trained, I think, for about 45 sessions or so, great success. We moved over to neurofeedback. I think we did about 15 neurostim sessions and then moved over to neurofeedback, and she had great results, ended up being able to titrate her medication down to, she was on just a tiny dose of it when she ended training with us, and was looking forward to titrating off that. She'd also had gotten herself a job working at a pet store where she had to clean pets, which was a big deal for her to get dirty like that. And so, and she loved animals, but that had been a challenge for her. So that's an example of where we might use tACS to help kind of synchronize those two sites in the brain. And then we have transcranial direct current stimulation. So what we do with this is we still have we'd be using two electrodes, again, the anode and the cathode, but what we're doing is kind of passing current just in one direction. So rather than the back and forth communicating or passing of the electrical current, we're just passing it in one direction, with the intent of getting the site that has the anode to stimulate and produce more of whatever frequency it is that we're using in that with that particular client, and then to inhibit what's going on in the place where the cathode is, or the negative uh, uh, electrode. And so what we're really doing with this is creating like larger network reorganization as we're getting that site to start to produce more of the brainwave frequency that we want it to produce. And as a result, it starts to reorganize. This can be really good for helping to kind of prime for neurofeedback. It makes the brain more susceptible. An example that I can provide for tDCS is had a, like oftentimes we'll use it for people who have really severe depression. And we want to, like, we want to send some more like SMR frequency to the left side of their frontal lobe. Oftentimes that's where depression shows up. And so we can use tDCS to do that. And we've done that really successfully with clients in the clinic. We had a young woman who had really severe depression, very suicidal, self-harming a lot, and was on the autism spectrum. We spent a good amount of time using tDCS on her and then moved her over to do neurofeedback. And again, a very big success story. She was able to get some work. She was just, she, you know, would talk about what a different person she was by the time she was done with training. And so that's a nice example, I think, of where we might use tDCS. And then we have random noise stimulation. So random noise stimulation really is used to kind of clear up kind of stuck patterns of activity in the brain. We refer to it as hypercoherence. So when we're talking about tACS, we're looking at more of a hypocoherence. With hypercoherence, we've got like we've got some neural patterns that are just stuck and can't get moved, and they're kind of overly synchronized. And so again, what we're doing, we're still using electrodes to do this, even though it's noise, and we're putting noise through the amplifier at random frequencies, depending on what it is. We might be using pink noise or brown noise. Those are good for people with anxiety. Brown noise is good for people with sleep issues. And what it does is, you know, it has an impact on the calcium and sodium ions, and what that tends to do is enhance neuroplasticity in the brain. And as a result, we start to loosen up some of those stuck patterns. I'm going to show you in a little bit a video of a client that we had where we ended up using random noise stimulation for him to treat some significant anxiety that he had that couldn't there's noise in the background. I'm not sure if it's something else. If somebody has something on that's on the Zoom meeting, could you mute your sound, please? So I will share that example with you shortly in terms of how we might use random noise. Again, we're using electrodes, we're putting electricity, you know, into the brain and creating that stimulation at that frequency. And then we have pulsed electromagnetic field stimulation. We call it PEMF. This is really used to kind of help the brain get a consistent rhythm of stimulation. When we do neurostimulation, if we are doing tACS or tDCS or random noise, we typically are also putting on the cap. So you can see the cap right here with the coils on it. These coils are what are producing sending the electromagnetic signal. And basically it's just generating that signal that will flow through the air, and then it passes into the brain. It also in the body. A lot of times we're using a couple of coils on the belly as well, as a way of kind of creating some communication there. So this can be good for just kind of nudging, getting neurons to fire. It's good for really good for reducing inflammation as well. And so we use this most often. This is in addition to one of the other three that we were talking about. So they've underneath this cap, they've got the electrodes to do the tACS or the tDCS, that sort of thing. This is the client I was talking with you about. I am going to just play the video and let him tell you his story. But just to give you a tad bit of background, he came to us. He had a reaction to some medication he was on, and it created really severe anxiety. And he's a therapist, and so he knew all about how to treat anxiety. He'd done everything that he could. He'd gone to a therapist, talked with them about did a lot of cognitive work, and was really successful at being able to calm down kind of all of the cognitive busyness that was happening with his anxiety, but he could not get the physiological part of his anxiety to calm down at all. And it had gotten so bad that he couldn't work. He could not see clients because he had such anxiety. So he decided to try something because he didn't know what to try. So he came in, we did a protocol. We tried to run a parasympathetic stimulation, neurostimulation protocol on him. Didn't do much for him, and kind of it wasn't a good feel for him. So we did a couple of those, and then we moved over and did the rest of his. I think he did 20 more sessions and did brown noise. And by about session 5, he was saying to us, I can't believe this. I am back to where I was. And he really was at a point where he felt like, and he seemed like, okay, I think we're good to go. You can just be done. But he wanted to continue because he wanted to make sure that what had changed for him was going to continue to change. So we did brown noise for a total of 20 sessions, and I keep in touch with him. He refers people to us. He continues to say he's doing great. So I think he's just a really nice example of when we might use just neurostimulation. He never did any neurofeedback with us. He didn't need it. This is all he needed to kind of get his system back to regulated, and then he was good to go.
Hi, I'm Corey from Minneapolis, and before I reached out to Fran and Adam at the Bhakti Wellness Center, I'd been struggling with pretty significant physical symptoms of anxiety. I had been doing pretty helpful talk therapy, and so a lot of my anxious thoughts had calmed down quite a bit. But I still had these physical symptoms of anxiety. When I would get nervous about something, I'd have this clenching feeling in my belly or in my throat, or my heart would be racing, things like that. And it was really getting in the way of my work and just my enjoyment of life. And so Fran recommended neurostimulation. And I was open to it, but I really didn't know if it would help or not. And after we found the right frequency for the neurostimulation, I was amazed. The physical symptoms of my anxiety almost immediately went from like a 6 or a 7 to like a 1 or a 2. And I continued to do neurostimulation for about 20 sessions or so, just to make sure that the treatment really kind of lasted and the effects would stay, the benefits would stay. And all the while that I was doing that, I felt really cared for, and I felt like what I had been struggling with was really important to Fran and to Adam. And I still, to this now, I feel that those symptoms have very, very much decreased. So I really recommend the Bhakti Wellness Center, and I had a very positive experience there.
Let's talk about neurofeedback now. One of my favorite things, and of course, if we switch roles, which we do every time, I would say now we get to talk about neurostim, one of my favorite things. So, but I do have a particular passion for neurofeedback because of the process, because of what happens. There's just the opportunity as a practitioner to be able to watch a brain rewire itself live in front of you there's just something there's something special about that. Like that is not something you get to do really any place else other than in a neurofeedback clinic where you actually get to watch a brain rewire itself. When we do neurostim, we know it's happening. We just can't see it. When we're doing neurofeedback, we actually get to see it happening. And that there's something about that that just utterly captivates my imagination. So Fran had used this analogy. I think it's a great analogy. This idea of learning, and the idea of learning to play the piano. And people will often ask us with neurofeedback, how long do the effects last? We'll have to say the effects are permanent. And so there's conversation around that. And the example I use, and I think the piano is a great one, is if you learn how to play the piano, and I mean learn how to play the piano, not take 2 lessons and then quit, but if you actually learn how to play the piano, you can stop playing, and 5 years, 10 years later, you could start playing the piano and with very quickly be back to playing, because those neural connections are there and they've remained even if you haven't been doing it. But with the brain, when the brain learns how to do something better, when it optimizes its circuitry, it will set about using that every day. So it's much like if you learn to play the piano and you play it every day, how much better would you be in 5 years? Well, that's what we see with neurofeedback. We catalyze a process that continues long after neurofeedback sessions stop. Like we know from research that if you measure where a person's at in terms of neurocognitive testing at the end of their 40 sessions of neurofeedback, they've scored better than at their entry exam. You measure them a year later, they're better. 2 years later, they're even better. So we know we've set off a process of optimization that carries on long before the 40 sessions. A little bit about the paradigm on a very kind of view from 10,000 feet, because pretty soon we're going to go deep into the weeds of the neurophysiology. So just staying on the simple end of it, basically it's an operant conditioning paradigm, right? It's Pavlov and the bell, same idea. And so here we're using a computer that is, so we're registering the EEG. It's being broken up into the brainwave patterns. It's being compared to a normative database. We've set parameters on what we want to have happen. And then a person is looking at a monitor and they're getting visual feedback. They're maybe also getting auditory feedback. There are systems that can do tactile feedback. So we can use any of the senses, but the most common is visual, to give a person visual feedback of how are they doing. And that can be as simple as a bar graph that's going up and down, or it can be incredibly elaborate of a very high resolution video game that's quite immersive. To the brain, it doesn't really care. The mind might be interested in how engaging is this paradigm, but the brain doesn't care. It just wants a signal. Am I going in the right direction? Am I doing better or worse? And so ultimately, that's what we're telling somebody with the feedback is kind of a yes or a no. And then the brain is rewiring itself in the moment around like, oh, you want me to do that? Do this. Yes, yes, yes. No, oh, not that. Do this. And then that's the loop. So the brain, the computer sees that change. It updates the feedback. The brain gets the feedback on its activity in the moment. And that loop continues. And that's what a training session is typically about 45 minutes of the person watching their brain rewire itself. We're going to do a little bit of a demo here in the room. We use the CAP method. It's not that long ago. I mean, we were actually trained on the place the individual sensors on the scalp method, but we very quickly decided, no, the paste is messy. People leave, their hair is messy. It's time consuming. And we just thought they have this great technology where you just put a cap on and a little dot of gel and you're up and running. So the amount of time that it took, the mess that it took, everything was just better from running a clinic standpoint, but also it put us doing kind of the highest caliber neurofeedback that's clinically available is the 19-channel Loreta neurofeedback. we can do the full spectrum from a single sensor on the head to 19. We can do the full spectrum, but because we've decided to go with the cap, we always have 19 on, so we might as well use them. And I'm going to get into a little bit as I get into the detail of why is that an advantage. The types of neurofeedback, there are so many varieties of brain-related things that come under the heading of neurofeedback. And what's challenging, I think, as a consumer is you have no idea if what's being marketed to you as neurofeedback is even neurofeedback at all. And I know the first neurofeedback provider that I saw, it was really more neurostimulation, that there was no feedback. It was a canned process. She put it on, pressed the button, left the room, and something happened, but I didn't know. I was an illiterate consumer. I thought I was experiencing neurofeedback. I wasn't. So that's the challenge, where people will look at neurofeedback and see that, like just here in Edina, there are, dozens and dozens of neurofeedback providers. But the difference between the training, the equipment that they use, the software they run, and the sophistication of the treatment plan that they deliver, that's where the difference comes in. And we decided to set up a clinic that allowed us to do the full spectrum, but it's pretty rare now that we would do a 1-channel or 2-channel training, surface EEG. We're much more likely to do the 19-channel that gives us full access to the brain, full volume, 3-dimensional. And again, I'll show some images of the difference that makes, just in terms of what it gives us access to in terms of deriving a treatment plan and delivering a treatment plan. Again, a lot to know about the different kinds of neurofeedback, what's good for what. So here's an image that I saw many years ago before I actually started doing anything in brain health. And this is by a guy that used to work, a doctor that used to work at Bhakti, who had a very interesting specialty, the cross-section of the hormone system and the immune system. So coming together of those two systems. And I remember the first time seeing this and just being kind of overwhelmed by the amount of information on the screen. Fast forward a few years, and I started in neurophysiology, and now I look back at this and I think, how simple. This is mapping out, kind of an entire system in the body. We'd find this kind of complexity if we looked at like a 2 millimeter by 2 millimeter square of neurons in the brain. We'd have this kind of complexity, let alone the whole brain. But it's a good model, in a sense, to look at, to see that there are these series of relationships, and the system, in this case, our biological system, it's an integrated whole. So if you put something in, it has an effect someplace else. And this is really the key takeaway, that as we go into, going into what's called predictive processing. And so this is modeling that's being used as a way to understand how the brain works. And the main thing here is we're going to look at a series of these, is to understand that the brain is set up as a series of kind of recursive, multi-layered networks. So we have large networks with subnetworks, all the way down, right? So we have these tiny little networks, and we can, if we follow again back to our biology, we can go all the way down to the genes, where we have gene regulatory networks. So we have a network at that level. But in the brain, we just, it's tiny little subnetworks to the whole brain as an integrated network in and of itself. And so when people ask questions that are very kind of linear, which comes our way all the time, is like, do you treat OCD? Do you treat anxiety? Do you treat depression? I have this particular symptom. Can you help me with this symptom? We're thinking about a symptom, but from our standpoint, where we're dealing with is these tiny little synaptic connections within networks, right? As Fran said at the beginning, we regulate dysregulation. And so our attention is way down at that level. When we think of behavior, I like to say like the distance between what we do in the brain and behavior is like the distance between the Earth and the moon, right? I mean, it's so far away and it's so complex. It's virtually impossible to predict, but it's not impossible. That's, again, what makes this so exciting and what's happening right now with the addition of artificial intelligence into predictive coding. The ability to understand neural activity to behavior is getting better and better all the time. So here we're just looking at a really simple connection. You can see the equation at the bottom that is kind of explaining the mathematical equation to understand just these 6 combinations of possible relationships. And so what happens is again, this is kind of a cartoon, it's scaled down, but here now we're looking at, we have levels of cortex. So we often think of like the cortex, but there is no the cortex. The cortex has levels. And within those levels, we might be talking about 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters of physical space, but there's an entire different process happening on that layer versus the layer below it. So the cortex is not just the cortex. We have to think that, the triune brain, like we have a cortex, we have a limbic system, we have a brainstem, but, not that you can't look at a map and see that, but that's not helpful at all when we actually think about brain function, because we have to think almost at the level of a neuron, or certainly an ensemble of neurons, a collection of neurons, and who they're in relationship to. That's a network. That's the functional unit that we need to be thinking about. So what we can see here is, again, just kind of a cartoon, but this is an actual experiment that was run. So this is mapped out in predictive processing. And so this is the kind of formulation that's needed to just try and predict simple eye movement. And you give somebody an exercise, they're staring at a cross, and they can look in one of the 4 corners, and you say, like, go ahead and just look in one of the 4 corners. This is how much computation takes place for that person to just move their eyes to a corner, right? And so much of the brain chimes in on such a simple, who cares task. You're just going to move your eyes. But there is actually a lot of brain information that comes in and impinges on that decision to just move the eyes. And so we can just think of, if something is as simple as just moving your eyes for no good reason other than you're part of an experiment, it's that complicated. What do we do when we start thinking about behavior and all of the different motivations that are coming to impinge on a decision to take a certain action? So here's another way in which they kind of scale it up, right? So we just keep adding these. And, there just wouldn't be enough room to actually diagram out all of the connections within the brain. So we make these little schematics, but then we have to imagine that there are billions of these. And that's the level of complexity that we're working with. Here we're seeing this is a lot of high-tech neuroimaging condensed into one picture. And so it tells an amazing story, both of the research that it took to get here, but also what this is bringing to the field that we do. Now, a good amount of this particular actually belongs to Fran's domain tonight. This is more on neurostimulation, but I like the images that they're pulling together and what it's telling us. And I'm going to lay some neurofeedback imaging on top of this. So in the corner here, we have just a tiny little sliver. So it's the suprathalamic nucleus. So this tiny little sliver of just above on the top of the actual thalamus. And these little areas that are colored, just to give you a sense of scale, those are something like 1 millimeter or 2 millimeter in size, right? So this is a very tiny structure. And then what we see, these tracks that are being broadcast through the brain. So from down here in the brain stem, and then here kind of in the suprathalamic nucleus, and then pushed up through the brain all the way up into the cortex. So here, these little color codes, we have dystonia, Tourette's, Parkinson's, and OCD. These are the 4 conditions that this particular study was mapping. And we can see like there's some similarity, but then there's some difference. OCD mapping much more into the frontal lobes over against Parkinson's and Tourette's, which are actually blended together, and they're very similar in affecting the motor strip, motor planning. And then dystonia also tends to come into the motor strip as well, but a little bit more posterior. So in this particular research, what they found was by stimulating that, like one of these tiny little, couple millimeter cubed region, they could have a profound effect on the symptoms of these different diseases. And again, to go and look at the research, it really is profound to see somebody with Parkinson's where they can deliver stimulation and immediately the person's physical ability to move is improved by multiples. And now what they've also shown is if you're off by a few millimeters, you can get no effect or unwanted symptoms, right? So precision seems to have a lot to do with it. But the main, for me, from a neurofeedback standpoint, is given that what we see here, if we just take the dystonia track, the kind of yellow gold track, that this cuts through multiple structures in the brain. So this is back to those nested loops, right? That we have these nested loops that are all having input into this process. So it's not like this spot that they've chosen is the only spot to have an impact on this condition. There's actually a virtually unlimited number of spots that you could choose. And the why of that is, again, if you come in here and you change one of these little centers within this nested network, the effects of that are both going to go down the network and back up the network. Right? And so any one of these, changing any one of these gives you an ability to affect the whole network. Right? And so that's one of the things why stimulation that's more general can work, because you can just, if you find a place within the network that's affected to begin to have change, you can begin to change the whole network. Right? So it takes away this idea that there is a spot, right? So Western medicine really likes this idea of there's just one place that we do this. In the case of deep brain stimulation, they want to have a target for Parkinson's or a target for OCD. And that approach is great. Our approach is more of a network approach, which is if you can affect the network, then you can affect the condition. You can begin to regulate the dysregulation, which helps ameliorate symptoms. So here again, this is a slide that going towards the how the field is improving. So from kind of left to right, it starts with where we started off was we had clinical intakes, clinical symptoms, and we try and look into the brain to see when somebody has these symptoms, what's the dysregulation that's happening in the brain? And we started to piece it together. As we've gotten better and better at the predictive processing, now, and what this research that we're seeing some slides from is researchers took imaging studies of patients that they didn't know anything about. They had no history. They were just given the imaging. And then they were to predict the symptoms that that person was having. And they had about an 85% success rate at being able to predict the symptoms that the person was having. Not just the condition, but what actual symptoms that person was presenting and living with and would be of clinical significance. And that's pretty remarkable from a neural decoding standpoint that we're getting that sophisticated. I'm gonna now shift into the kind of imaging we do. So we were just looking at diffusion tensor imaging. Now we're looking at independent component analysis, which is a part of EEG analysis. And what you're looking at is an independent component. And I put this one in here because this is basically a normal one. So when Fran was talking about pink noise, if you do a line from corner to corner on the screen here to here, just a straight line, that would represent pink noise. So essentially random noise. It's equal probability of appearing everywhere on that line. That's kind of the background sound of the brain. The background activity of the brain is considered pink noise, which is why we use pink noise and brown noise stimulation, because it helps the brain find its way back to its kind of natural global rhythm, which is pink noise. But because we're not actual random, there's more going on. We should see a peak here at 10 hertz, which is alpha. It's what neurons do when they're not busy doing something else. They tap their toe at 10 hertz saying, I'm ready to do something. If you need me, ask, I'm good to go. So we should see a peak at 10 and then a little bit of a rise there kind of in the middle, but that's it, right? So that's a normal, healthy, independent component. So then we're going to go here. So this is a client of mine where we're looking at an independent component, and probably right off the bat, just having seen the normal one and now this one, you could probably look at that and go, guy, that's not normal. You're right. That's what caught my attention as I was going through the data is we don't have an alpha peak. We have a little bit of a theta peak, a hint of an alpha, a drop off, and then actual several. So this is, at the very least, what we can say is this brain region is dysregulated. It is, in a sense, it's overactive because of the absence of alpha. We know there's too many neurons that are busy doing stuff and not sitting there ready to do something. So we've got an overactive, in this case here, we can see what area is this. This is the anterior cingulate. And then also you can see in the Loreta imaging, the distribution. We can see that, so this is the frontal lobes. So we're getting a little bit of the prefrontal, the frontal's more left than right, well, more right than left. And then it wraps down the temporals down into the amygdala and hippocampus. So that's a fair amount of real estate that is being affected by this pattern of dysregulation in the brain. So that's another thing that caught my attention is it's not a local effect. It's having a very broad network effect, which means it's going to affect a lot of things for this person. And we tend to think about the brain as just cognition, memory, thinking, planning. That's what most of us think, but we forget that the brain runs everything in the body. So it is running our digestion, it's running our hormones, it's running our blood sugar levels, our thermal regulation, it's running everything. So if the brain is dysregulated, it isn't just affecting our cognition, right? It potentially is affecting everything that the brain runs, which is everything. So this pattern, we wouldn't necessarily expect to only have dysregulation in cognitive aspect, although it is the one we tend to talk about the most. So to say a little bit about the anterior cingulate. So the way I think about it, I mean, it does a lot. It's a very important piece of the brain. But the way I kind of shorthand it is, it's how I think about how I feel. Right? So in a way, how I feel is coming from the posterior cingulate forward to the anterior cingulate. There, it mixes in with the frontal lobes and executive function, and I'm bringing into bear all kinds of information that kind of puts how I feel into some kind of context. And so the shorthand, it's how I think about how I feel. So in my conversation with this client, when I brought that into relationship, it's like, tell me about this. What emerged in the conversation was, so here's a person who is to meet them, you would think like, why is this person in neurotherapy? Right? They're very at ease, relaxed, chill, wonderful, in many ways kind of excelling in life, very personable person, right? But as we started to get into, what's going on, their struggle is presenting as difficulty academically. But when I look at their EEG, like I said, you kind of have an Olympic brain here. This is a really impressive brain. I'm not seeing the typical signs of academic struggle. Well, what it is there's a challenge in allocation of time and attention and bandwidth. So he will spend hours at night just on the phone, scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and going down rabbit holes and just hours and hours and hours. And, we could say that this is a pleasure-seeking activity, right? We know a lot about what's happening with devices and dopamine, but the question is, where is the executive function that says, well, I probably shouldn't stay up for 6 hours tonight because I have to get up and go to school tomorrow and be in class, and I have to be able to learn. And that is the cycle. Like, you can't not do the activity of the spending the time on the phone and going down rabbit holes, and learns incredible amount of things about things that aren't relative to where he is in his life and what he needs to know. So it's not a lack of intelligence. He's highly intelligent and sought out for his intelligence in certain areas. It's just not being applied where it needs to, right? So this is more of an executive function problem in a planning and having that bear on behavior. So how this maps out, it maps out really well when we look at the area of where this dysregulation is, where it's being broadcast to in the brain. It maps very well to the actual problem. So from a that's interesting. Not entirely sure what happened to my slide there, but fortunately, images came through where we can see that. So this is this is that client's actual brain map. And where you see these little kind of dots and lines, these are areas that we're showing with significant dysregulation. Right? So in our, my little cartoon down here, if we look at this, we pick a few places that are scattered throughout the network, and we add in, these are dysregulated. They're sending misinformation into the system, right? This is basically what we have up here. So scattered throughout his brain, he has all of these areas of dysregulation that are sending misinformation into the network. Any one of those becomes a place where we could intervene. And so what I like about neurofeedback is I don't necessarily need to choose which one of those I'm going to train. We can train 20, 50, 100, 1,000 different brain metrics at one time. And so if in this case, I wanted to train 500 different brain metrics, if we look at a little cartoon down here, right? If I wanted to train all of those at one time, I could. And I could take that brain and move it towards kind of neurotypical relationship from area to area. How are these areas talking to each other? We can move that towards neurotypical. So here we're helping that brain regrow, rebuild neural infrastructure to move energy and information around in a neurotypical way. Right? So we're not going after a problem spot. We're actually teaching this brain how to move energy and information in an optimized way. And then what we see is the behaviors that were not functional start to fall away. Right? So when somebody says, do you treat anxiety? Not really. When we're doing neurofeedback, there's no place that has this thing called anxiety or depression or OCD often. Now, there can be, somebody can have an acute brain injury, and so we know there's an acute place that could be found on, say, fMRI. But for the most part, we have distributed dysregulation. And with 19-channel neurofeedback, we're able to gather up many of those points of dysregulation and move them all towards regulation. And to me, that's the gift of the 19-channel. If we use something like a 1 or a 2-channel, all we could do is surface EEG, right? So we could just change the pattern of EEG at the surface, at the cortex, right? Which can have a positive effect. But with the 19-channel, we're not limited to just doing that. We can reach down deep into the brain and catch the dysregulations there and move those forward as well. So it just gives us a larger embrace of what's dysregulated within that system. So this is a fine time for any of our folks who are on Zoom. If you have questions, you can unmute yourselves and go ahead and ask. And for the folks here in the room, just gonna say a little bit about kind of our, our process. So typically what happens, folks, we may start with a free consult, or we just talk with people what's going on. Is neurotherapy a good match for what's going on? Kind of talk through the process, the cost, all of those things. Then once we move into, we're going to move forward with the treatment plan, we may start with our assessment. So our full assessment, which might be a behavioral assessment, neurocognitive testing, genetic testing, QEEG, ERP, RFD. So that's the biofeedback side. Also, what we're going to do a little bit here tonight is some biofeedback. So we do a very comprehensive intake, and then we put all of that information together and we do a report of findings. So usually a virtual meeting where we go over all of that information, lay out a treatment plan. And so you might want to turn that the other way. The sensor usually goes, yep, there you go. So we do a report of finding where we lay out, like, here's what we found. Here's a couple of options for treatment plans, go through the cost of that, the time involvement, all of those things would be laid out. Person makes a decision in terms of what they're up for. And then we would move into the training. Training is typically, we used to say 20 to 40 sessions, but I pretty much now just say 40 sessions because most everybody makes that choice to do 40 sessions. So we go twice a week for 40 sessions, so 20 weeks. And that's a typical course of neurotherapy. Might a person go less? So Fran gave an example tonight of somebody who did go for fewer visits than that. Might people go more? Absolutely. Sometimes more is because it's needed to get the results that we wanted. But more often than not, it's the client saying, I like the change that's happening. I would like more of this. I'd like to continue. And so then we might go, 50, 60 sessions. It really depends on what's happening with the individual, and are we seeing the change that we want to see? Are we seeing progress? Then we will support that person to continue the therapy. Because the way you think about it is like it's taking your brain to the gym. You don't necessarily, the average person doesn't sign up for the gym thinking, well, I'm only going to go 40 times and then I'm not going to work out anymore, right? It's a little bit more of a lifestyle thing. And I would say neurofeedback for sure could fit into that if it were affordable to, have a $100 monthly membership and you could go do neurofeedback as much as you wanted. If that was the paradigm, I think that would be the way to do it. Because the way to think about neurofeedback isn't really about fixing a problem, treating a condition. It's not kind of pathology based. It's really optimal performance based. You know, at the end of the day, we think of everything we do as peak performance. That's what we're doing, is we're moving a brain towards its own optimal functioning. And in a certain way, it's like, where does that stop? It doesn't stop because a brain is done. It generally stops because people want to allocate their resources, time and money, to something else. Pause there. We're in the process of getting our volunteer wired up, which is great. Again, I'll say if any of the folks online have questions, go ahead. Otherwise, I was checking in with Fran to see if she wanted to do another case study while we're waiting for Adam to get our volunteer wired up. So maybe I'll just share a little bit of one of mine from many years ago, early on. But now I kind of refer to it as psychedelic injury. So I was not aware of kind of how much people were experimenting or are experimenting. It's not historic, it's gotten to be more. But I just was unaware of how many people out there are experimenting and microdosing with various psychedelics. And having this client come in who was having trouble because of his experimenting and microdosing, he introduced me to this entire subculture of people who are both talking about what they're doing, but a big part of the conversation is people seeking help because they have a psychedelic injury, and then they don't know what to do with it, and maybe they talk to their doctor, their psychiatrist, their psychologist, and those professionals just don't know what to do. And not to say that I had any idea what to do, but we did what we did, which it would do is we did neuroimaging, we looked at his brain, we looked at the dysregulation, and what we saw, and his main complaint was some of the things that you think of as a positive about some of the psychedelic effects, which are kind of the wild colors and thing looking very, very kind of wild and technicolor, that wasn't stopping when he was sober. So he was walking around in the world with all of those technicolors. So what we were able to do is find the areas that were dysregulated and train those back to normal. And sure enough, in 3 sessions, and within a session, he could report his vision returning to normal, his perception of the world returning to normal. And so at 3 sessions, we got him back to normal. A few months later, he did it again, but now he had a different thing. This time it was lines. So all diagonal lines looked like they were attacking him. So it was very hard for him to move through the world without just really feeling, well, attacked by diagonal lines. So same thing, we found the area that was dysregulated. In a matter of 3 sessions, we were able to re-regulate it. And he didn't have any other occurrences that needed treatment, but he also didn't stop microdosing. I just think he got smarter about it.
So what we're looking at here is our volunteers EEG. So each one of these lines up here correlates with one of the sensors that is on the cap that she's wearing. So we can see, I'm going to do this for you. I'm not being we can see the different brain waves that are happening at the moment. I can see right now that we have some jaw tension left-sided for sure that's happening. And that's not actually EEG, that's EMG. So one of the things we're always looking for is to make sure that we're seeing actual EEG. So it also could be noise in the sensor maybe. And then we have, over here, we've got what we call head maps. And so this shows us the different frequencies and where there is dysregulation occurring. We have to take this with a grain of salt because you're doing a lot of blinking right now. So it's going to show up some frontal sensors here. you can see here that it can show us like if there are things we're seeing in the cool colors here. So green would be neurotypical. And anything in the cooler colors is deficiency, and anything in the warmer colors is an excess. So, you know, we're going to see this in anybody's brain as they are busy, engaged in thinking or looking or being awake in some way. Adam is setting this up so that we can do a neurofeedback training. So this is going to be a Z-score training that we're doing. We're just choosing a network. You can see here that there are all kinds of networks that we could choose from. We also could train specific symptoms or components in the brain. Over here, you're seeing like what, depending on what network we pick, what broadening areas we will be treating. You can tell, so we're going to be training amplitude, but also connectivity. So this is the game that we use most often, and it just, you know, people get to pick flying objects. It's something that just keeps people a little motivated, and then we get people who are interested in being the high scorers, and sometimes it's not always children, although it we do have a kid up at the top. So what's going to happen here is, so the computer right now, like, is reading your EEG, right? It's coming into the computer, it's reading it, comparing it to a database of neurotypical brains that are normed for age and gender. And then what it's going to do is whenever your brain starts behaving like the neurotypical, it's going to have it's going to basically tell the game to fly straight, right? So your object's going to fly straight. If your brain starts to veer from neurotypical, you'll see the plane either divert in one direction or wobble some. So what we want you to do is to just stare almost with your eyes kind of loosely, like if you were watching a show, and just stare at the target and let your brain do the work. So right now, your brain is actually playing this video game. So while you as the client are busy flying the video game, we're busy watching your EEG and what's going on. So on this screen, we can watch what's happening just in terms of your raw EEG, but also in the head maps. Are we seeing excess or deficiency patterns? But then here you can see, that's why she was scoring so well. You can see that we have, this is showing us how many measures. Adam, what are we training? 311 metrics at the training. This is what we see here. The ones that are above the line are the ones that are dysregulated. We can tell, like specifically, like what broadening area we're training, what is dysregulated, what band, like delta, theta, alpha, that sort of thing. So this is the part where Guy was saying before how amazing it is to watch a brain regulate in real time. This is what we get to watch and see happen. And of course, there's report from the client, but we get to see this on a regular basis. And this gives us indication of how well the brain is responding to the training. What's your sense of how it feels? Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I love it. Yep. So this is, we've suddenly moved to talking about your mind instead of your brain, right? Because your mind is the thing now that's getting really busy, kind of wondering, okay, like if I move my head a little, or is it when I'm blinking, or yeah. And Yeah, yep. And in reality, it's none of that. It is what is happening in your brain, right? The brain functioning. So whenever your brain starts to behave less like neurotypical, it's gonna veer away versus go through the hoop like it just did when your brain is behaving like the database of neurotypical brains. Yeah. No, there's nothing you are doing. It's exactly right. And so your job is to sit there. We always talk about it like sit there and watch a friend play a video game and cheer them on. You know, your friend happens to be your brain. Well, this is much more active. No, yeah, yep. So this is part of the training of the training is, you know, it takes clients a couple of times to really kind of adjust to that idea that, oh, there's really nothing that I can do that's going to do this work. It's my brain. And so the best you can do is just sit quiet, stare, keep your eyes loose, your jaws loose, that kind of thing. Yeah. Anything else you want to say?
I was just gonna say, so recently I've been training a young girl, 8 years old, and she's very fidgety, right? She does not like to sit still, and that's been one of the primary reasons that she's in is her system is very dysregulated. So we play a game like this, and she actually, you know, very quickly kind of falls asleep. It just gets bored with it. It's not stimulating enough for her. So not in this particular specific game, but in another game, what I did was I put up the practitioner screen so that she could see what I would be looking at. And I just gave her a little bit of orientation of what I wanted her to do. So it would be a version of her watching this, right? And I just said, look, I want you to bring all those pointy lines, I want you to bring them down. That's it. That's the whole instruction. Well, she became utterly fascinated with that, like playing the game, falling asleep, yawning, fidgeting. But then when she was seeing that she could control this line with her brain, that was fascinating. Full attention for the rest of the session. Yeah. So, you know, we never know what is going to grab a particular person and interest them and be the motivation that engages them in the process. You know, often just gamifying it is enough, but you know, you just got to find what's the right thing for that person. And in her case, it was seeing what she was doing, and that amazed her. So.
There's a client right now that Adam's training who he's using videos because he similar kind of got bored with the game. And so he's got his own videos on USB. We use those for training. And so basically what happens there, the feedback is when his brain is doing what the database you know, similar to the neurotypical database, the video plays at full screen, normal sound. When his brain diverges, the video starts to fade, the sound gets softer. And so that's the feedback that's happening and that kind of thing. And so sometimes we'll use videos. We have some kids, I had a kid I trained several years ago who could not, when we started, the frustration of not being able to be in control made him just like he could not handle it. And he would get really, really upset and worked up. And so we went to videos, and that made all the difference for him.
So more often than not, we're going to do neurofeedback and run biofeedback monitoring in the background. So we're looking at a person's autonomic nervous system while we're training their central nervous system. But we could just as easily switch that to make the biofeedback the main thing. And then the game they're playing, the monitor they're watching is about their biofeedback. And then we would monitor their brain to see how changing the body is changing the brain. Because sometimes the dysregulation is coming from the body and not from the brain. We had a great example of a lady who with chronic depression, decades-long chronic depression, did everything, all the medications, all the treatments, everything, came to us thinking neurofeedback might be the solution for her. Along the way, so we're doing neurostim, we're doing neurofeedback, mixed results, looked at her biofeedback and found out she had an extremely dysregulated autonomic nervous system. So started training her autonomic nervous system, and almost immediately, within 7 sessions, she actually stopped treatment because she felt like so much positive change had happened. And we set her up to be able to do that training at home rather than needing to come into the clinic to be able to do biofeedback. She could do it at home just as effectively. So again, just an incredible change by just regulating the autonomic nervous system. We do this both, yes, as part of the intake. So I had mentioned earlier just briefly what we call an RFD, or resonant frequency determination. So that's looking for when a person's cardiac rhythm, respiratory rhythm, and baroreceptor come into harmony. So what's the breath rate? So 5 breaths, 6 breaths, 7 breaths, 5.5 breaths. What's a breathing rate that harmonizes a person's autonomic nervous system? That's their resonant frequency. Everybody has one, and whatever yours is, it's that over your life course. So we do a resonant frequency determination as part of our intake. And then training might include some of this if this is where we see significant dysregulation. We're looking at a number of metrics up here. So we have actually just the actual heart rate variability, coherence, so how well your respiratory rhythm and cardiac rhythm are harmonizing, coherence, your peripheral temperature, skin conductivity, blood volume, pulse, which is kind of like a proxy for blood pressure. It's not exactly that sort of spectral analysis. Just tells us some deeper information about how your heart is doing the heart rate variability. So this is the quality of the heart rate variability versus just a raw number. It tells us how's it getting there. And there's kind of grades of better and worse for how one has a high heart rate variability. And then we can also hook up sensors to muscles to do muscle tone. So we can get another piece of biofeedback through muscle tone. We're not seeing that here. We're just kind of looking, so a couple of things we might say, your peripheral temperature is probably a little bit low, given the temperature in this room. We'd expect you to be warmer, like being up around 90 and a little over 90 right now would be typical. Heart rate variability, so far what I've seen, good. So we like to see somebody, an adult up in the 10 range is actually impressive. 20, partly right there we were seeing just because there was some movement in your hand. So we had a little bit of an artifact that was skewing the numbers, but that you're hanging out kind of, in that 10 range, great. Like I said, we would be monitoring this while somebody is doing neurofeedback. And then if we're seeing stress responses here, that might lead us to change something in the neurofeedback. It might lead us to change from neurofeedback to biofeedback to regulate the autonomic nervous system. Again, it's really just about collecting more data, so there's less chance that we're missing something. Like the example of the lady with the depression. If we hadn't looked at her autonomic nervous system, we never would have caught that. We would have continued treating it as if it was depression. And I should say another thing that came out of that after some intense interrogation was because her EEG had showed the likelihood of a traumatic brain injury, but she completely denied any history of it, but Fran was able to get it out of her. And we found out that indeed she did have a significant head injury that probably resulted in a brain injury, although given her age and the time when this happened, there was, no conversation about concussion or that it wasn't anything. It was just a thing that happened in childhood. But one of the things we know is traumatic brain injury can have a dramatic effect on the autonomic nervous system. So linking up that not only did her EEG show it, but when she finally came forward and said, oh yes, this event happened, that had us look at the autonomics, and then we saw the autonomics so dysregulated, corrected the autonomics, it resolved the depression. Yeah. So we're just really generally as a clinic fans of more information is better, even if you're not using it. We are all done. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. Our Zoom folks, thank you for joining us virtually. Come see us in person sometime. We're here again next month.